Welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Atheist. I am Andrew Seidel, the Director of Strategic Response here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Amit, Communication Director of FFRF. As always, if you've got a comment or question for today's show, ask them right here in the comment, atheist@ffrf.org. Again, it's Ask an Atheist at ffrf.org. We'll start off with an FFRF member, Fred Spurl. He's happily retired in Reno, Nevada, and the Arizona Sun ran an article about him, and this is why we're speaking about him. Like many of us, Fred recently received a $1,200 check as part of the stimulus to help him cope with the COVID crisis. Well, Fred actually decided the best use of this check would be to donate it to groups that need it the most. So one half of the check he gave to a nonprofit, a local nonprofit called Martha's Village, and the other he gave to a group called the Freedom from Religion Foundation. So awesome, and that's why we are giving Fred, and we hope Fred is having a good time and staying healthy out there in Reno, and is disproving the myth that religious belief has a monopoly on generosity and caring for our fellow humans.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I think he is doing a great job of disproving that myth. Religion does not have a monopoly on generosity or caring for humanity. And our guest today is someone who's worked to debunk that myth using sociology. One of my favorite scholars, Phil Zuckerman, is going to help us break down some news, especially about the pandemic and how religiosity might affect government responses, and some data on the intersection of religion and race and racism. So, little things, tiny topics, nothing earth-shattering. Huge stuff. I can't wait to talk about this. So Phil is the professor of sociology and secular studies, that is a thing, and the associate dean of faculty at Pitzer College. He is the author of numerous books and tons of chapters. He studies the rise of secularism. Some of his books include What It Means to Be Moral, the Oxford Handbook of Secularism, Living the Secular Life and Society Without God, for which NYU Press has just published a second edition. I think I've got that right, Phil?
Good one.
Now, in recent weeks, there's been just a whole lot of data and analysis coming out, and you've been covering it on your Twitter feed. So if people aren't following Phil on his Twitter feed, please do that. It's at Phil_Zuckerman. Get over there and give it a look. And we're going to be talking about a lot of it today, but that's why we wanted to have him on, because he's been so active in breaking this down and explaining it for all of us to understand.
Yeah. Should I speak?
And a lot of that data.
Amit, go ahead and give the shout out to Ryan Burge, who's doing a lot of that data, and then we're going to bring you on, Phil.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Thank you, Andrew. A lot of that data has been published by Ryan Burge, who was interviewed actually by FFRF co-presidents Dan Barker and Annie Laurie Gaylor for Free Thought Radio just a couple of months ago. And you can listen to the link to that and link to the interview and listen to the interview after you listen to this show by going to the website or clicking to the link that's there on your screen. But please do that after the show.
So, Phil, I can't wait to talk about these with you. I mean, welcome to Ask an Atheist. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm excited to introduce you to, hopefully, a whole bunch of new viewers here who are not familiar with your work. So welcome.
Thank you. Awesome to be here.
Now, you're a sociologist of religion, and last month you posed a question on social media that I think about it all the time. And we had a little jokey exchange about it too, but what is the difference between religion and occult? And you asked that in response to this video of Paula White, the mega preacher, televangelist, who actually has a job in our White House. And we're going to show a little bit of that video, and then you're going to try to answer that question for us. And this video comes from our friend Mrs. Betty Bowers, America's best Christian.
Mahanda rabosoko, mahanda akasata, reke yamanda raboko sokota, ronda yakande eke seke la mama manda rabakase, meta rabakande la babakaso, yala mananya no, sakayato yakande, ya makato, yabatadia sitia kano, yakatara sitia. Power!
Wow. So Bruce blurred out some of that there. Now, Phil, I mean, so what is the difference between a cult and a religion?
You know, I put that out there a little bit tongue in cheek because there's been a long running debate about that in social science, and there's different criteria. So you could say, there's no difference. You could say, well, people will say cults have, people follow a charismatic leader. Well, most religions have a charismatic leader at the helm, whether it's the Pope or a local church or synagogue or the Rebbe for Hasidic Jews. Sometimes they'll say, well, cults engage in nefarious or dangerous or illegal activities. Again, a lot of religions do that as well. The Catholic Church is in the business of pedophile rape and molestation. You find that kind of stuff in many religions. Many people will say cults have weird or strange beliefs, and it's like, well, that's in the eye of the beholder. So there's a lot of debate. What it seems to be at the end of the day is actually a cult is just a new religion that doesn't have a lot of followings yet, doesn't have a lot of real estate, doesn't have a lot of wealth, and hasn't been around a long time. If a religion sticks around long enough, it gets accepted as a religion, and it doesn't matter how crazy the beliefs are, how crazy the practices are. If you just get enough people to follow you, and you can hang on enough and get through several generations, you'll be accepted. I mean, the Mormons is the perfect example, right? When the Mormons first came, they were seen as a dangerous, nefarious. They had a charismatic leader, Joseph Smith. They were breaking all kinds of laws. They had deviant sexual practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were hounded and hated, but they managed to survive. They hung on. They were able to institutionalize their beliefs and get some property and get some wealth and get enough people to join. And now you have senators and presidential candidates who are Mormons. So it's a debate. Is a religion, usually a cult is just a religion that people don't like or they just want to put down. On the other hand, yes, it is true. There are some religious groups that are marginalized that do follow their leader to an extreme degree. So I always feel like it's a matter of degree. Like, does the charismatic leader tell you who to marry and where to live and what job to take? And do you think they're actually God on planet Earth? And what kind of activities, how much are they cutting you off from your friends and family? So it's a matter of degree. So if there's a strong charismatic leader, they're cutting you off from friends and family and the rest of society. They're urging you to, they're monitoring every aspect of your life. They're urging you to do dangerous or violent things. Then we're in cult territory. All I was trying to say here, though, is when you look at that Paula White, that Elmer Gantry, it's crazy times. It's Looney Tunes. And most people like to think of, religions as respectable and somehow civilized. And they like to think of cults as, crazy, wacky, batshit, nutso. Well, look at Paula White. She really pushes the envelope here.
And so, I mean, it sounds like there is a little bit of truth to the old joke about, and this is what we were joking about, that numbers really is the difference. That, either in terms of age or in terms of followers, there is some truth to the difference between a cult and religion just being an issue of numbers, it sounds like.
Well, think about it like this. If you're one person who believes something for which there's no empirical evidence, that no one else shares that belief, you and yet you're totally devoted to it and you think it's the most important thing in the world, and no one else believes it, understands it, and it can't be proven, you're considered some form of delusional. If 20 people or 30 people believe the exact same thing, they share that belief, but no one else does, now you're kind of a cult. If 500 or 600 people, now you're a sect. 15,000, 50,000, now you're a denomination. You can get 1 million or 5 million, now you're a religion. The belief can stay the same, the practices can stay the same, it's all about numbers.
Okay. All right, Amit, you're up.
Well, Professor Zuckerman, perhaps the most famous religious photo op in recent memory is that of President Trump giving his speech and then getting the way cleared to a photo op of holding the Bible upside down in front of a church. Let's see that here.
This was just unbelievable. I mean, to violate the First Amendment, every one of the 6 rights in the First Amendment, for this Christian nationalist photo op. It really blew my mind. Now, Phil, so
Professor Zuckerman,
go ahead.
Take on.
Sorry?
So as a sociologist who studies secularism and religion, what jumped out at you from that video? What was your takeaway from that?
Rarely are these things so explicit. Rarely is pandering just so obvious. Like, at least have some subtlety, right? At least have some coded wording. At least have some, dog whistle. I mean, it was so blatant. It was so blatant that it's all about symbolism. So it's not the contents of the Bible that matter. It's that it's a Bible, right? Most of the evangelical Christians who love Trump violate every teaching of Jesus. So they don't really love the teachings of Jesus. They don't really love the morals and ethics that one can find in the Bible amidst other heinous things. It's just a symbol. It's a symbol of their race pride. It's a symbol of their racism, masked as some kind of nationalism. It's a symbol of this is us, this is our power. And look, white people in this country are experiencing real status fear. They are facing demographic changes, status changes. And so that Bible just becomes a symbol of white nationalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and so to have the president of the United States in the face of peoples of color saying we can't stand the lynching anymore. We're not going to take the lynching anymore. It's not okay. We want justice. We want equality. We want fairness. To stand in front of a church, this man of who represents nothing but selfishness, greed, hatred, racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia. I mean, the sum of it all, and to hold up that Bible, it's just like, can there be any doubt now in anyone's mind what a pernicious, nasty game is being played here?
Well, that was definitely a nice summation, and you brought in a lot of the things that we want to discuss sort of in the next round here, racism and religion. This has just been a huge topic lately. And but before we get too deep into it, we're gonna look at a lot of data, and I want, if you can remind everybody about the self-identification when people are taking polls and responding to queries on religion. It's usually about how they self-identify. And can you remind us what that means, and about some of the differences between, say, nuns and somebody who might identify as atheist or agnostic, so that we have a little bit of a better frame when we start talking about race and religion here?
I'll do my best. Surveys are not precise tools. They're blunt tools. They give us a fuzzy sense of things, but they're the best we've got for certain kinds of data collection. So if you can ask people how they identify, and that usually refers to some kind of group membership or heritage or family identity or personal identity. It doesn't necessarily say what they believe, and doesn't say what they do. It just is how they identify. So if you ask people, which religion are you, or what religion do you identify with, again, that's a kind of group belonging. And you could say, Christian or Baptist or Jewish or Reform or Muslim or Sunni or Shia or Catholic, or you can name it. And more and more often, there's the option called none of the above. So if someone ticks none of the above, all that tells us is they do not identify with any of the religions offered. They could possibly identify with a religion that simply wasn't listed. Maybe there's a small subset of Rastafarianism that just doesn't make it on the survey. And they're like, well, I'm none of those. But that's usually not the case. If there's 50 or 60 options, sometimes there's an option for other, and you can fill it in. Also, if they pick none of the above, it doesn't tell us that they're an atheist or agnostic. It doesn't tell us anything. Someone could believe deeply in God and totally reject identifying with any religions. They don't go to any membership, or they don't affiliate with any congregation, but they still believe. It's a good indication that someone might be atheist or agnostic if they tick none of the above. Most people that tick none of the above are non-believers, but not all. Probably a third still believe in God. Then you can ask a different survey question, which really gets at beliefs. What do you believe about God? I strongly believe, I somewhat believe, I'm not sure, et cetera, et cetera. That tells us if someone's an atheist or agnostic, at least in orientation, if not identification. So there's just different ways to measure it, and you've always got to be mindful when you're reading these kind of studies. I see a lot of secularists out there, when they see that 38% of Americans are none of the above, they think that means 38% of Americans are atheists. No, it just means they don't identify with a given religious tradition.
Okay, that's perfect framing for us. So we're talking self-identification when we're talking about this. And I want to drill down and specifically talk about systemic racism and where atheists and agnostics land compared to everyone else. So if you ask people whether racial problems are rare and isolated, this is where they come out. So you can see white evangelicals way up at the top there. And then atheists and agnostics way down at the bottom there. So that means atheists and agnostics don't agree with the idea that racial problems are rare and isolated. White evangelicals, Mormons, Orthodox, white Catholics do agree that they're rare and isolated. So, this was fascinating. So, you have atheist, agnostic, then Black Protestant, then Jewish, then none. So, Phil, what is going on here? This really just hit me. This was really striking. It was sort of it verified my instincts, but tell us what's happening here.
Okay, so first of all, in that study, people were given the choice to identify with either a religion or a belief orientation. So you'll see in that list, you could identify in a number of ways. So you could identify as nothing in particular or atheist or agnostic. So what's really important is, if you're trying to measure racism in a population, degrees of racism, you can't ask people, are you a racist? No one's going to say
that doesn't seem like it
right?
would work.
A few people might say yes, maybe 4 or 5% of, but everybody's like, no, I'm not. The most racist people are going to say they're not racist. So instead, you have to ask questions that try to get at someone's orientation towards race in their society. And that's exactly what this question does. I was not surprised by this. About 10 or so years ago, I've written about this. A Duke University professor with some colleagues at USC did a meta-analysis, meaning they wanted to really understand the relationship between religiosity and identification belief and racism. And I think they thought that they were going to prove that religious people are less racist. And so a meta-analysis means they sifted through all the studies based on how valid they were. So how good was their sample? How good was their methodology? How good was their multiple regression analysis? And they took the 75 best studies that were the most rigorous, with the random samples that were generalizable, that used the most rigorous methodological tools, and they analyzed this relationship. And what they found, lo and behold, was that secular people exhibited the least racist tendencies, and the more religious people exhibited the most. And agnostics, self-identified agnostics, came out as the least racist. Now, that's not to say there aren't racist atheists and agnostics. Of course there are. It's not to say that all religious people are racist. Of course they're not. But we deal with averages and correlations and patterns in the social sciences. And on average, atheists and agnostics tend to be the least racist. Now, of course, it's going to intersect with race. So African Americans who live under a racist system, even though they're highly religious, are also going to obviously recognize what a racist society we have. And that's why you see Black Protestants are right there with atheists and agnostics. Then come Jews, who are highly secular in belief. Often they identify with their Jewish community. So there's something going on here with people who don't believe in God, don't believe the Bible is the word of God, don't enjoy church, and it allows them to better understand racist structures, racist institutions, and racist realities. Whereas the strongly religious, and the more strongly religious you are, like the more you're devoted to Jesus, the more you believe the Bible is the word of God, the more you go to church, the more racist you are.
And let's take a look at one of those graphs now. This is just fascinating stuff. Amit?
Yes, so this graph that we are seeing right now is a distribution of racial resentment scores, and ties in racial resentment breaks it down by race and by religious belief or non-belief. So, Professor Zuckerman, can you talk a bit about this? As we can see,
I don't know what Ryan here, how Ryan is measuring racial resentment, but my guess is that he came up with several questions trying to tease out how people feel about other races. Do they resent them? Do they feel like they're taking their jobs? Do they feel like they are dirtying up their neighborhoods? Do they feel like they're committing more crimes? Regardless of the actual evidence or data, how do people feel? So he probably had a battery of different questions that tried to tease that out, and then he amalgamated them somehow to get this measure and these percentages. And of course, what do we see? No surprise. White evangelicals exhibit the highest levels of resentment towards other races. Black Protestants the least. You should see Cornel West's latest beautiful speech on CNN with Anderson Cooper, which addresses this in particular. And Hindus very low, Indian immigrants, and then, of course, atheists, Buddhists, agnostics. So coming down at the secular people tending to be the least racially resentful compared to white evangelicals and so on and so forth. So it's affirming this pattern. And what's nice about this is you're seeing consistency in the data. In other words, one study or even one indicator, you have to be careful. But when you see numerous indicators revealing the same pattern over and over again, that means you're catching something that's real.
And Bruce, can you throw that up again too? Because I was noticing, if we can throw the graph back up one more time, I was noticing that if you look at the scores, so Ryan Burge organized this by people who scored 4, so you can see it's decreasing. But if you look at who scored zeros, more atheists and agnostics scored a 0 than anybody else, and more atheists and agnostics scored a 0 and 1 total than everybody except Black Protestants. I mean, it really is. I mean, this data is just it's amazing to me.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. That definitely could have gotten lost in the weeds because your eye goes to the red. But I'm so glad that you pointed that out. And, we have to ask ourselves what's going on. I think there's multiple ways to understand it. It could be an intersection with education, right? So the more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to be an atheist, and the more likely you are to understand racism. But many studies control for educational levels and educational attainment, so it's not always reducible to education. It also could have to do with how much a lot of psychological studies show that secular people, atheists and agnostics, are less likely to obey authority, and the religious are more likely. Are you a questioner of the status quo? Are you more attuned to injustice? And interestingly enough, secular people tend to be much more empathetic to the suffering of others. They tend to be much more questioning of the status quo, questioning of authority. And so if you have a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, theological white supremacist Christian nationalist status quo, atheists and agnostics are going to be able to see through that much easier than people who are buying into it.
So it sounds like you're warning us a little bit too about trying to derive a cause from this correlation a little bit there. Now, Amit, I think you wanted to talk about the change in racial resentment too.
Yes. So we have a chart that shows the change in racial resentment over the past 8 years or so. If you can take a look at that.
Yeah, atheists didn't even have a data point for it from 8 years ago, I guess. So that's an improvement in itself.
That's interesting. Agnostics do. So, Professor Zuckerman, what sort of trends do you see here? Can you enlighten our audience about that?
Okay, so this is a little bit of a hard graph to check out. There's 2 items. The first is a statement saying generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower classes. Do you agree or disagree, right? And then the next one is Irish, Italians, and Jews and many other minorities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Do you agree or disagree? And then it's comparing 2010 to 2018. So the blue is when this question was asked in 2010 and then in 2018. So what we see is, how can I help here? All right, let's just look at, so the ones that are most likely to be racist, right, to blame black people for their own oppression would be, again, white evangelicals. There it is. Also, let's see. At least with the second data. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's stick to the top. So if we stick to the top, generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower classes. Do you agree or disagree? So I'm trying to understand this. Yes. Okay. So let's look at black Protestants. In 2010, 72% agreed with that statement. That, a majority, yes, and that went up even a little bit in 2018. But if you look at evangelical whites, they were the least likely to agree that slavery and discrimination are to blame, right? Less than 20% in 2010. It did tick up a little bit to 24%, but they still are at the bottom there. Mormons are at the bottom there. Orthodox Christians are at the bottom there. So it looks, again, we're basically seeing the same thing. Evangelicals, Mormons, the strongly religious are the least likely to consider slavery and discrimination a cause of black suffering, whereas obviously black people are, and Muslims are up there too, Buddhists are up there too, but atheists are well up there, agnostics are high, nothing in particular. So again, we're seeing the same patterns here where secular people, with some religious people, usually immigrants and people of color, having the greatest understanding of this country's racist history and racist laws and racist practices, and the strongly religious, the most religious, I would say, the ones that most love Jesus, most love their Bible, most go to church, having the least understanding or the willful ignorance regarding this country's racist policies, racist practices, and genocidally racist institutions.
Now,
yes, the appalling scores by white evangelicals and the Mormons, that really stands out for me. Thank you, Professor Zuckerman.
Absolutely.
It does jump out at you. Now, to me, one of the most interesting data sets that you commented on recently, it showed religious and racial subsets compared to liberal or conservative political ideology. And so we've got a graphic of that. So I read this as saying that atheists of all races and ethnic groups are the most progressive politically. Am I reading that correctly?
Amen. Hallelujah. 100%. And let's be clear what that means, right? When we say progressive, we mean we want a society that alleviates suffering. We want a society that is fair and equal for everyone. We want a society that is just. We want a society that's actually following the Bill of Rights. We want a society that is based on a true, healthy democracy that gives people, regardless of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, or religious orientation or not, the fairness and equality and liberty and justice. So, we got to be clear when we say progressive here that progressive means empathetic, it means ethical. It means wanting a society based on empathy and ethics. And so there you have it, right? There's the social science showing us who's more empathetic and who's more ethical and who's more really believing in democracy. It's the more secular, intersecting with some people of color, to be sure.
So we're going to move on from this fascinating discussion. We've had a couple questions about references and citations and things like that. I'd recommend that people are interested in that, go back and watch. You can look at the bottom right-hand corner of those graphs. It does have the data sets that Dr. Burge used. Brian Burge, and Phil's been commenting on his data on Twitter, and also we do have that Free Thought Radio interview with Dr. Burge that you can go listen to as well. Now, I really want to get into the COVID, the crisis, the pandemic that we are still in, that amazingly has been, and possibly rightfully been, trumped in the news. And I want to talk about the responses among countries and governments and the religiosity of the population being governed, because there's some really interesting data and just also anecdotes. And I know that in your new edition of Society Without God, you showcase the societal health of the least religious countries in the world. So first, let's just talk about New Zealand, because New Zealand had its last COVID case on May 22nd. So the country is COVID-free and has reopened. So, I mean, Phil, how did they do that?
Well, let's
just solve that problem for us.
Yeah, let's remember that just to preface this, that New Zealand is one of the more secularized countries in the world. You've had a huge shift in the last 40, 50 years. So you have a huge chunk of New Zealanders, Kiwis, who are atheist or agnostic. I think it's up to 40% now. I could, don't quote me on that, but it's around there. So religiosity has plummeted. Church attendance has plummeted. Religious identification have plummeted. And you have one of the only out secular leaders, the president or prime minister. I'm not sure what they say in New Zealand.
Prime minister.
The prime minister was raised in a Mormon family, but she rejected that a while ago, and she is an out atheist / agnostic, depending on the interview. So this is pretty remarkable. And it yet again, so what did they do? I don't know the details, but I know that they used empiricism, science, medical expertise, logistical expertise, and had a game plan, had a plan on the ground, and did what needed to be done. They followed the advice of people who have knowledge based on data. And that is a particularly secular value, right? When we talk about values, it is a religious value to believe things without evidence. That is actually one of the highest achievements, to have faith in the face of all facts, to believe something even in the face of contrary evidence, is a value for religion. It's the opposite in secular culture. To believe things without evidence is considered problematic. But what we're seeing now is it's also a matter of life and death. Like, we can go back and forth about like how important is faith, how important is empiricism. This COVID-19 is showing us that the values of secularism and the values of religion often mean life or death. And those who cling to faith are often putting themselves in harm's way. And that's their right as adults, but it's certainly not their right for their children. And that's, murder. And for the secular, they're following the what we know. What does the data tell us? What does the empirical research tell us? What do the medical experts who are basing their conclusions on the science know? And it seems to work. So not everywhere, it's not absolute, right? Sweden's a bit of an outlier, but the countries led by secular governments with largely secular populations have taken the most rational and empirical approaches to battling COVID-19, and they're seeing the greatest success, while those countries headed by people of faith, think of Brazil, for example, with largely religious populations, are faring the worst.
So, I mean, it's not a coincidence that New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, identifies as an agnostic or an atheist, or that they have, we don't want to oversell it, because New Zealand's also a very isolated country. It's easy for them to shut down travel for people coming in, and it's got a smaller population, et cetera, et cetera. But you're still saying it's not coincidental that they have a secular leader, secular government, secular populace.
Exactly. I would never, it's not monocausal. I would never be reductionist and say like, hey, turn atheist and all your troubles will go away. There's a lot of factors, right? Even just density of population is huge. It spreads more in concentrated urban centers. It spreads less in rural areas. So if you're living in rural Montana, which Montana has one of the lowest rates of COVID-19, it's also the second least populated state per square mile in the country. Certainly the most in the continental United States, but I'm thinking of Alaska here. So there's a lot of factors on what causes rates of COVID-19 to go up or down. What I'm saying, though, is a secular government and a secular population is part of that. It's a very strong part of it. I'm no fan of the Vietnamese government. They are dictators that oppress freedom of expression and freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but they're very secular, and they were also excellent at battling their COVID-19. And I also don't, there obviously are many religious people that accept science. Like, I'm not trying to create this dichotomy of like, there's only secular, rational, scientifically minded people and only, crazy people of faith who reject all science. There are many religious leaders in social democracies, in secular societies that still believe. But when you want to make these correlations and look at the patterns and the averages, clearly when it comes to facing pandemics, having a rational secular government and a largely secular population helps. It's not the cure-all, but it helps big time.
Absolutely.
And Professor Zuckerman, you have pointed out that this is not just an international trend, that even domestically we see this going on. And the Deep South is called the Bible Belt for a reason. The Economist has a chart pointing out regional differences. Can we look at the chart and can you comment on the differences and the reasons why these differences are there?
Okay, so again, we always have to take into account there's a lot going on here, how densely the population lives. So that's why you see a lot of blue in those sparsely populated states like Montana and Wyoming and parts of Idaho and so on and so forth, and even Utah. And that's why you see the hotter pockets are going to be more in New York City and so on with its high density. However, according to the economists' studies here, and I don't know all of their data and measures, but what we are seeing is that Bible Belt, Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, these are the states that have the highest rates of God belief, Jesus belief, Bible belief, and church attendance. But if you look at the Pacific Northwest, if you look at Oregon and Washington, aside from the population dense centers there, if like, for example, near Portland, but if you look at and up in the Northeast, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, so New England, the Pacific, the Northeast and the Northwest are among the least religious states in the country. They have the lowest rates of church attendance, lowest rates of God belief, Bible belief, prayer, et cetera, whereas the Bible Belt, the South there, the Southeast, have the highest rates. Look where they're having the most trouble with COVID-19, in those highly religious centers. Again, it's not just because of religion. The Bible Belt, those states are also the poorest states in the country. So there's a lot going on there. They have weak healthcare systems. They are very weak infrastructure because they don't like to pay taxes. So they don't have strong healthcare possibilities. They're highly uninsured. They have the highest obesity rates, and obesity intersects with COVID-19. So if you're overweight and you get COVID-19, you're at a higher risk, especially if you have diabetes. So there's a lot of factors at play, but I'm just trying to say that religiosity and secularity are part of this, a big part. And we need to talk about that and not just ignore it.
And so the last thing I want to talk about, and then we're tons and tons of questions are rolling in because this is such a fascinating topic. It's not just religiosity. I want to talk about Christian nationalism a little bit here too, because Christian nationalism, I think, plays a pretty big role. And Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry have a new book out, Taking America Back for God. And in that book, they divide Christian nationalists up into sort of 4 different categories on a spectrum. And we're going to go ahead and show a graph. So you have the rejectors, the resistors, the accommodators, and the ambassadors. So a rejector of Christian nationalism is like me, who rejects the idea of a Christian nation, who maybe they didn't write a book on it, but people who are members of FFRF who would reject this idea entirely. Resistors maybe don't agree quite as much. Accommodators, and then ambassadors, 100%. Yes, this is a Christian nation. We are founded on Christian values. So that's sort of the spectrum. And so Sam Perry tweeted this out, one of the co-authors, and he noted that Christian nationalism makes whites less likely to acknowledge anti-Black discrimination, but it makes Blacks more likely. So that was what he was putting. So basically, what he's saying is, for whites, Christian nationalism is this exclusionary, in-group, us versus them, otherizing mental construct. And then, as Perry wrote, but for Blacks, quote, but for Blacks, the idea of a Christian nation is connected to the ideals of justice and equality. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is, how are we going to account for Christian nationalism when looking at this, either now or in the future? I mean, I know this is a growing field, and just wanted to get you to at least touch on it before we move on to audience questions.
I'll try to be brief. First of all, it shows how complex these things are, and that when you're looking at the social world, you're looking at intersectionality always. It is impossible to disentangle class from race, from gender, to religiosity, to nationality, to ethnicity. These things intersect in a multiple ways in entangled webs that advantage and disadvantage some in some ways and others in other ways. And so you're seeing this right here. So, for example, what Christian nationalism means to white people and Black people is different. What Christian means to white and Black people is often different. So you're seeing that big time in that chart. The way I make sense of this at the end of the day is I resort to tribalism, right? We have a bioevolutionary history of living in small groups. We developed cooperation in those small groups, but we also developed an us versus them mentality, which helped with group survival in some ways and in some instances. And that's part of our bioevolutionary heritage, to distrust and dislike and even hate outsiders, people we think are different, people that we think might threaten us. So it's very easy for dictators and manipulators and advertisers to tap into that aspect of our bio-evolved psyches and personalities. If you can tell people that there's this other group that is different, that is dangerous, that carries diseases, that wants what you have, that wants your land and your food, there's hundreds of thousands of years of bioevolutionary history that starts to reverberate, right? Many of us transcend it, or we try to transcend it. But when I look at white Christian nationalism, what I see going on here is really just a tribalism in the guise of religion. And so it's a nationalism that's really a kind of, this is us, this is who we are, and we love Jesus. Forget Jesus's message. That's not important. He's just our totem. He's our symbol. He's our symbol of our group in a very Durkheimian sense, right? Forget what Jesus taught us to do, right? How to be charitable, nonviolent. None of that matters. It's just, what does Jesus symbolize? What does America symbolize? And I'll just end here. I remember getting into an argument one time in the gym about something about politics, and this guy said, "Do you love America? Do you love America?" And it's like, what is that? What do you mean by America? Do you mean the Constitution? Is that America? I love the Constitution. Do you mean like the people who live on this part of the earth? Well, I don't know them all. I love some of them. I love some of them. Do you mean like McDonald's? Do you mean Coca-Cola? Do you mean Nike? Like, what is America? And so for Christian nationalists, America just takes on this symbolic, like, who was it that James Woods, I think that actor, said, whatever Trump's flaws may be, no president loves America as much as him. What do you mean, love America? Does he love democracy? He's thwarting it. Does he love racial, rights for all races and peoples? He's denying that. So does he love the Constitution? He's thwarting that. So it almost takes on this symbolic weight. To be Christian, to love America, it means my tribe, my white privilege, my patriarchal, homophobic, so on, so white pride. Sorry for that.
Yeah, I always think of James Baldwin's quote when somebody asks me if I love America or something along those lines. I think this is close. I love America more than any other country in the world, and it's for that reason that I insist on the right to criticize her. Love James Baldwin. Anyway, we got a ton of questions rolling in. We're having a little bit of audio problems with Amit's feed, and I'm sorry for that, viewers. I'm going to pose the questions here. So Corey Clay asks, he notes that the Bible, or she notes that the Bible was used to justify slavery. The Africans made Christianity their path to freedom then. Why are so many people of color still attached to that religion? I think given that it was used to justify slavery is the gist of it.
You want me to respond to that?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
The people demand it.
Quickly, we have to be very careful of that narrative, because that narrative is often used in a racist, pejorative way to say, what is wrong with these black people? Why would they adopt the religion of their masters or enslavers or oppressors? There is a deep and long tradition. Yeah, there's a deep and long tradition of black skepticism towards Christianity and free thought. I highly recommend this book called Black Free Thinkers by Christopher Cameron. I just finished reading it, and some of the most powerful and important people who fought for the rights of African Americans: Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Foreman, Huey P. Newton, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston, and so on and so forth. Oh my God, A. Philip Randolph were atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, Nella Larson. So there is a deep, long tradition. But to me, it's very easy to explain. Enslaved Africans and African Americans were denied any form of agency or institutional liberty, in other words, to form their own associations. And the only area that they were often allowed to have any kind of social interaction was in the realm of religion. Even that was highly regulated. It depended on which county you were in. So in some instances, yes, black people could congregate, but there had to be a white minister. Or yes, black people could congregate, but there had to be 2 white people present at all times. Or yes, black people could come to church, but they had to be in the balcony, and so on and so forth. But in some instances, they were allowed to have their own religious ceremonies. And let's not forget also, many of them brought Islam from Africa across the Atlantic. So I would say that for black people, structurally, the church was their only place for a sense of refuge. The black minister was the only viable leader for certain stray African Americans. So it developed as a communal hub, a communal refuge, and the stories, particularly Old Testament, resonated, right? The enslaved Israelites, plus Jesus' suffering. So, it kind of makes sense. And to this day and age, the churches often are a source of community and refuge and identity and heritage and family. But even today, there is a strong and growing presence of secularism within the African American community as well. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, I mean, what you were talking about just reminded me of a Du Bois quote. He said, and again, I'm butchering this, the black church predates the black home. Which just, I mean, if you pause to think about that, I believe it was written in Souls of Black Folk. I mean, if you pause to think about that and really ponder what that means, I mean, that is just, it's striking. And if people want to learn a little bit more about this, we had a great discussion last week with Mandisa Thomas, the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers. So I would encourage everybody to go watch that. Now, we've got a question, and I mean, Phil, we've been talking about Christian nationalism and what it means, tribalism in America. We aren't able to show this on the screen. So I'm going to have to do it on my phone, which we'll see how this works. But Sean St. Pierre says, at one of the protests I attended, I spotted a Christian cross on a military Humvee. Is this something you guys can do something with? So hopefully everybody can see that. So there it is, and you can see the military. Well, I don't know why I'm drifting off camera. I apologize. So first of all, I'll say, Sean, and anybody watching, if you've got a complaint about a state church complaint, you think something crossed the line, like you saw a cross taped onto a Humvee or painted onto a Humvee that belongs to the U.S. government, report that on the FFRF website. Go to FFRF.org. You can see there's a legal tab, and you can report a state church violation. We'll keep all your information confidential. We will try to deal with the violation for you and keep you informed about what's going on. This is what we do. We get between 4,000 and 5,000 state church complaints every year. Most of those we are able to stop without going to court. But Phil, I mean, this goes to what you were talking about. This is, it's all those different tribal signals kind of rolled into one: military, nationalism, Christianity, all right there.
I mean, a cross on a military vehicle. Can there be? I mean, this is like, a vegan, with a McDonald's, wearing a McDonald's t-shirt. This is like, whatever you think of Christianity, Jesus, and he did say he was purportedly said some unpleasant things, like you should hate your family. I've come to bring a sword and not a cross. But his overriding message was peace and nonviolence and forgiveness and mercy. I mean, whatever you think of Christianity, and I don't believe the Gospels are true history, but the story itself of Jesus is of a pacifist, a radical pacifist. So to put a cross on it just gets to show to my point that it's not the content of the faith that they are trumpeting. It's a tribal marker.
Tribal marker. I mean, yeah, that's a great way to just describe that. So Janet Turney asks, recently I watched a documentary, The Family, and its residents at the Cedar House and on the C Street House. I was so appalled. That's a documentary on Netflix. If people have not seen it, it's based on the book by Jeff Sharlet. Highly recommend it. I interviewed Jeff Sharlet for FFRF's TV show Free Thought Matters, which you can also check out on our YouTube page. So she's wondering if the family is still going strong, and do they have a tax-exempt status? Is there anything that we can do about it? Yeah, I mean, not really a question, I guess, Phil, you know it much about. Unless you want to take a stab at answering that, I'll probably go ahead.
I actually don't. I don't know the legal status of things these days.
Yeah, and my understanding of it is that it's a pretty amorphous sort of group, and I don't know. I don't believe they have any formal IRS status at all. Or whether or not there's anything that could be done about it if they are a church. If you want to be a church in the U.S., all you have to do is say, I'm a church, and the IRS gives you an exempt number, and you are a church. So, I mean, this is one of the biggest problems with our system right now. Churches also don't have to file any financial disclosures with the IRS. Annually, FFRF and every other nonprofit and charity in the country that are not churches have to file Form 990s, which track every penny that comes in, every penny that goes out. Prevents fraud, prevents abuse, prevents people using the nonprofit system to launder money and engage in other criminal activity, except that there's this massive black hole and loophole for churches. Anita Heisch asks, we the taxpayers literally paid for the POTUS to harm peaceful protesters in front of the White House and to endorse the Bible. So this is, I'm assuming, talking about that walk down the street. What can we be doing about that? What's FFRF doing about that? Phil, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe what people watching can do when they're in terms of engaging, at least on the rhetoric that we're seeing surrounding this? And is there an effective way to sort of undermine it or point out the hypocrisy of it that you've been trying to show?
Well, there's a couple questions here. What can be done? And let me speak to that first.
Okay.
Everybody I know who has ever worked in any kind of elected office, I don't know many, but I know some, or people who know people in elected office, is there's only if you're not calling your elected representatives or emailing your elected representatives or writing them, that they don't know how many people care about a certain issue, and it's just not on their radar. And it's only going to become part of their agenda if a significant number of Americans continually email, call, or write their representatives and say, I don't like this. I care about this. Suddenly, they're going to say, and I even heard someone said they had like a metric where it was a U.S. state representative, and I knew someone working in their office as an intern, and they were literally told, like, if you get an email on a particular topic, we're going to say that counts for 50 other people that feel that way for that one email. If we get a phone call, we're going to say that counts for 100 other people. If we get a handwritten letter, that's going to count for 150. And that's how they tallied the items of their agendas. Like, well, we got this many emails about this issue. We got this many calls about this issue. And if secular people who care about the First Amendment and the separation of church, if they're quiet, it's not going to be on any elected. They got too many things to deal with. They're going to deal with what is being it's the squeaky wheel, who makes the loudest noise. This is why one of the reasons the NRA has been so successful. They got their members to continually be a presence on the phone lines, the emails, city council meetings. So if secular people really care about these matters of separation of church and state, they have to make that known to their elected representatives in the Senate and in Congress and the governors.
I actually think that's a perfect answer, and I'm gonna even not really add to that, other than to say, yes, there are staffers who actually are responsible for counting up opposed and for whatever the issue is out there. And if you think that your voice doesn't matter, I mean, look at how much public opinion has shifted just in the last few weeks on, for instance, Black Lives Matter. And there's plenty of data out there showing it. The only reason these people have a job, these people, elected officials, have a job, is because you vote for them. And if they know that you care about something, that's going to change what they care about because they want to keep their job. It really, really does have an impact. And we're going to stop it there because I can't believe, I just looked at the clock for the first time in this interview and we're already at 12:55 almost. I apologize for Amit's audio issues there, everybody. We really wanted to get him more involved in the conversation, but I know it's hard for some people to hear. Now, Phil, real quick, you did a great job talking about secular values and comparing them to sort of religious values. And I think that's from your book, What It Means to Be Moral. Is that right? Is that where you focus on that most? I just couldn't remember which one of your books it was. It's a fantastic book, and I love it because it's something. It's not just atheism as we don't believe in God, but these are the things that we do believe in, and I think it really ties together a lot of the data points that we were seeing earlier in the program.
Thanks.
So I'd encourage everybody to go pick that up.
Thanks so much for that, Andrew. Yeah, absolutely appreciate that.
Well, Phil, thank you for coming on. Amit, thanks for being here as well. It's always a lot of fun. And again, I'm sorry for everybody. We went so long. That is our show for the week. Thank you for joining us on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. If you want more information about FFRF, check out our website, ffrf.org. And we will be back next Wednesday, noon Central Time, for another episode of Ask an Atheist.